Then what about you?
I was born and raised in Baltimore, and then I guess my mom moved to the county, but they were split, So I split my time between like the county and the city, and eventually they took me out of the cities or the city school system and put me in the county school system. So the first step, I guess, was the county, and then I moved to Harford County, and then I eventually moved to where I am now, which is in Cecil County, which is pretty far away.
Yeah.
So right now I live about an hour from Philly and an hour from Baltimore.
Okay.
Based on 95. So, if I get the itch to go to the cities, I can go. But at the same time, I can also, get a real crazy dose of nature. It's totally like a different environment. And, people are people, but the environments are quite different. And that it's an impressive thing to find some nature and some solitude and some of that. It's sort of a hidden kind of scenario. When I was in the city, it wasn't the same. Like it is a different story. So I guess I'm lucky in that kind of sense where I get to, we really do get to visit some crazy, really unusual Maryland environments. I mean, right now I live in a water town. It's called Northeast, Maryland. And it's got like things that I've never seen. It's got 5 different soil types and stuff because the town itself is sort of like it's on the beginning of a peninsula. So there's lots of little tributary creeks and rivers that end up hitting the bay. So there's actually 5 rivers in this little town, or not this town, this county. And you see the evidence of such great, environmental changes and different things that happen here. You can see it really quickly, and it's pretty impressive. And I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss, but I'll probably cuss. So sorry.
You're fine.
But you see these massive rocks on either side, and I'm always like, man, that's crazy. Like we go down to Port Deposit, and Port Deposit's a little town, but it's got this massive granite rock on either side, and it's just this fascinating like section of geography that just is very unusual. It turns out those rocks are 4 million years old.
Jeez.
And it's from, a volcano that actually separated and laid out this sort of, this valley that allows for most of the water all the way up from New York to come down through this one watershed into this river and then ends up in our bay. And you just don't know that stuff. In Baltimore, I'd be walking around, they'd be like, you can't touch the water, Phil.
Yeah.
They're like, why? I'm like, because you're going to get something. You're going to get something.
Yeah.
I mean, we got this one dam here. So like in Maryland, we get to the dam, the Conowingo Dam, and we're like, that's it. Maryland actually goes a little bit above that, but north of that. But Pennsylvania's got tons of dams. They got, 4 or 5 more. And each one holds, and each along the entire waterway is hospitals and wastewater treatment facilities and all this stuff. And it turns out that's where you get your water, like the stuff that you drink. So here, when I was in Baltimore, they had the golden eggs, which are now in trouble, right? But before that, they were the golden eggs. You drive by and you'd be like, I don't want to drive by. You roll up your windows and turn on this thing.
Yeah.
And you'd be like, oh man. Up here, those golden eggs are a water treatment facility. So they actually, when I was a kid, Baltimore had the number 2 cleanest water in America. Like it was the best, like you could, it was sellable. Up here, on a real rainy day, like today it's raining pretty good, I'll get a note in the mail in about 2 weeks that'll say that I got to boil my water. And that's because the water that's coming down from New York and through Pennsylvania and through all of that stuff ends up being the water that we use to drink. It's called surface water. So here, and actually it's everywhere except for Baltimore, one of these massive cities that they have to really do good. It changes the name of the game. So you start to think about it a little bit different, and you're like, huh. Why is that? And the more rural you get, the more tied in you get. But you become, you end up understanding a lot more and becoming a little bit more dependent instead of, and interdependent, I guess is the right way to say that, with the local environment, because it affects you more. And in the city, you're sort of shielded from that.
Yeah.
To a degree, like your initial stuff, but the long-term stuff sits there and gets you on the back end, like you didn't know about. The air qualities for shit. And you know, the big companies that are taking all your trash, if they throw it in the incinerator, they'll put it in the same landfill that sits right next to the waterway, which is the same surface water that ends up in, and then you wonder why you got this weird, you know, gross stuff happening to you. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing over here, but it is, yeah, it's pretty far away. Yeah, it feels a lot more like I actually live in a small town and a water town on top of that. So there's a lot of this localized scenario. So it tends to make the world a little bit smaller, and you know, you have a little bit more connection with the people around you. And the result of that can be pretty impressive in a lot of different ways. But the cool thing about it for me is that it really enables me to focus on what I have control over, instead of, you know, what's going on way over there and I'm going to get mad about that thing over there. Here locally, you know, if you focus on yourself and, you know, this locus of control or whatever you want to call it, this center point, instead of being so distracted by way the hell over there and judging yourself against that stuff, you can actually have a lot closer of an impact. And that's sort of, you know, one of the things that helped us, or helped me. I think my wife already knew that stuff. She's a lot smarter than me, but they, you know, she generally is. But yeah, I think it helped me sort of understand, you know, that you could complain about something or you could do something.
Right.
You know, in this smaller town kind of aspect, you can really have a greater impact just by enabling people to do the thing. So in the city, I don't know, it's a little bit different. There's a lot more people, so it makes it a lot more difficult to enable everybody to do this thing. If we do a cleanup, it's really about enabling the community to clean up the community, right? It's not like rocket science. All of our programs are the same. They're just paths that enable somebody to do something that they were already wanting to do. And up here, you can do that and see it differently. It's a different strategy in the city. So it's an interesting process, but you know, the recycling industry or the recycling program tells me, you know, is one kind of strategy. The cleanup initiative is a different kind of strategy. The water monitoring is another different kind of strategy. The, you know, adopt, all these things are slightly different strategies that enable different things. And what do the people actually want to do?
Right.
You know, that's a big thing to make it, you know, a sustainable thing. The feedback loops have to be there, and it has to be something that people would like to try and do. I explain this stuff differently to different people, but it always comes back, the simplest way to explain it is just, you know, we were, this last time that you could vote or whatever, we were standing in line, and I guess people, like, there was a big ass line and people brought their kids and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was at like a school, and the kids they do what kids do, which is, you know, they eat candy, and then if there's no trash can around and nobody to whoop their ass because they didn't put it in the right thing, they just drop it on the ground. So eventually, if you're standing in line for a really long time, you're out of school, you're going to start seeing all these little, you know, wrappers and whatever. So everybody in this line's all whatever, because it was pandemic season too, and they're all sort of stressed and whatever, and they're looking at this trash on the ground. And the feedback loop in their head is very strange, because they look at it, they don't like it, it doesn't look right, makes them, you know, they get a negative feedback response. But then they don't do anything, right? They don't pick it up, they just look at it, and then they get them, now they're frustrated. It's a different part of the mind. Now you're frustrated because you you shouldn't have to pick that up, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
This whole thing. And they get more and more mad. And I was watching this, I was standing there, you know, doing whatever, it was cold. And I was watching this gentleman and he was so mad. He was just mad at this whole scenario. There's trash on the ground. So I like looked down and there was trash on the ground. So I picked it up. Seemed like easy, right? You know, can you hold my spot in line, pick up this trash? And I walk and I'm walking to the trash can that's right in the trash can. And I picked up one up that was right next to him that had, you know, really upset him. And I threw it in the trash because, you know, what are you going to do? You do the thing, you know, and that simple action of, oh shit, he like had a whole mind thing. He was like, oh shit, I can pick it up.
Right.
And then he did. And then it was really funny. So it was like, I literally picked up two, it was probably some old lady's stuff. And all of a sudden, you know, this guy started picking it up and then some other people started picking up. And because they weren't doing anything, they were just sitting there, giving them an action that enabled them to do or correct or work on the thing that was upsetting them was really all it took. And by the time I actually ended up going to vote, which was like another half an hour, 45 minutes, it was a long line. Yeah, the whole place was friggin' cleaned up by the people in the line.
Right.
And it was just because this guy had been very obviously upset, and I picked up two things that were those originals and threw them. It was just this idea that, all right, here's the need is you don't like the trash there. That's a very valid need, because if it's on the ground, then it devalues what it's there. And then we find that trash ends up being a magnet for other trash. So if you have a clean area, you will throw trash in a different area.
Yeah.
Just humans, that's what we do. But if you see trash there, you're like, oh shit.
That's where trash goes.
Right, that's trash. And more trash ends up there. So it tends to be like, and we see this all the time in the cleanups, if you clean up an area and it looks pretty good, to throw trash there, you have to overcome your own shame. So like you internally have to go, oh, I'm that asshole.
So you think that mirrors kind of your experiences with dealing with different dispensaries where initially maybe dispensaries were like a little standoffish about the initiative just because they didn't see it as like a viable avenue. Then they saw someone else committing to the action. And then they were like, oh, maybe there's some value in doing this. And that kind of changed their mindset. Did you have any experiences like that?
We did. Yeah, we have each. So when we started the recycling program, it was, you know, it's for the recycling program itself is literally for everybody. It's a for us, by us kind of program. And it is just to enable people to do something with this stuff. They don't, you know, you're a patient, you come in, you buy weed, you smoke your weed, and then you're left with this plastic thingy. And then you don't know what to do with it. So you think you're going to recycle it. So for us, I thought I was going to recycle it. So I was stupid. I asked the question. I was like, do you have to take the label off? That was my question, you know, to enable the existing industry to recycle this thing. And they were like, I don't know that answer. So we got this education in recycling and ended up finding out that none of this stuff is recyclable, which sort of was like, that's dumb. And then when we went to the dispensaries and we said, hey, you know, did you know that this stuff is too small to be recycled? They were like, no, I didn't know that. And some of them, you know, you ask these questions to different people and it sort of builds on. And when we were asking different dispensaries, you know, about it, first, they didn't know. And then second, they were afraid. I was like, all right, so why don't you like do something about it? They told me, you know, when we first started, there was a concern with compliance. So when we first started, it was, it's November 2019, so right before pandemic kind of. And when we started to ask people different things, they told us that they were concerned that it wasn't compliant because at the time, if a patient had come back in and dropped off recycling in a dispensary inside the dispensary, it would have been considered something called green waste. So And this goes back to every single time that's slightly different obstacles and things to enable people to do what they inherently want to do. So this was called green waste. And that actually put a dispensary in jeopardy. Like they would be out of compliance. They would be potentially liable for fees from the MMCC. And it was just this inaccurate feedback loop. I'm trying to do the right thing, but you're going to fine me for it? That's dumb. Don't do that. So we ended up, talking to a lot of different dispensaries and finding out what they wanted to do it. They wanted to do something. This wasn't, the amount of packaging waste in any industry isn't new, but the cannabis industry and the patients and everybody else, the people working in it, were aware. They were aware of this issue and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to pick up the trash and put it in the trash can kind of deal. And they had a couple of blocks. The first block was the compliance issues. And then the second thing was, there was a question about how you get people to think and know it's okay to do this. There's a thing called, it's a theory of design, and it's called Maya, M-A-Y-A, and it's most advanced yet acceptable. So that's about where people will adopt something. They won't go farther than that. So if I tell you can fly to the whatever moon or something, you won't do that. But if I tell you, I got an electric drone that's going to pick you up and move you, so, if it makes sense to you, you're okay with it. But too far is too far, you won't do it. So while people were sort of concerned about, the dispensaries, the industry itself was concerned about the obstacles it had to enable, people to do it, we were trying to figure out what those things were. And then, not intending to actually develop a recycling program where we do the recycling or the first step. It was totally a research intent to try and figure out how to get somebody like TerraCycle or Preserve or somebody else who specializes in this thing to actually be able to do it. And then eventually those people said they can't. When we went to TerraCycle, we figured out how much essentially plastic in pop tops that the industry locally just here in Maryland was producing. And they said they couldn't do it. And we can't actually do it for other states. We get questions about other states all the time, but we can't cross the state line. So there's no difference in DC cannabis containers than Pennsylvania cannabis containers and Maryland cannabis containers. They're all too small to be recycled in your normal single stream. So everybody's got the same problem, but if you travel across state lines, it's considered diversion. It's a federal offense. So we fill up a Subaru with pop tops and drive across, let's say Pennsylvania. I live very close to Pennsylvania. That's a federal offense. And that's a bad feedback loop, right? It doesn't make any sense. So the first feedback loop was Maryland and the Cannabis Commission's feedback loop that was really blocking the dispensaries from even trying anything. So we redefined it. And Maryland was, the first state to redefine it. And they did it really easily. Other states have had to pass bills to do the exact same thing. So they have to pull legislation and stuff. They sort of settled on recycling when I went to the MMCC and talked to them about it. But I pushed for reusable. I said, what about reusing the container? Why don't, I don't know about you, but I've been smoking weed for a really long time. And if I had an extra bag, I'd fill that bag kind of thing. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have to go buy a new bag every damn time or whatever. It just seems simpler. Why don't we just wash it? It turns out that you need a lot of different answers. There's not just one solution. And so anyway, I didn't know how to do legislation. I'd never done that before, but I didn't know how to do recycling either. So I said, what about recycling? They said, show me recycling, sort of calling my bluff that you could build a recycling program specifically for these things. And eventually, I guess I got irritated because they said bullshit. And so we ended up making one. And it's a pretty incredible process. To build a nonprofit is different than building a regular business. It's similar in a lot of ways, but it is different because it is fully mission based. So you can't actually make money and apply it to anything differently. Like the structure itself limits you to focusing on the output of what you're doing. So it was a pretty interesting process, and we ended up working with so every county in Maryland has their own recycling coordinator. I don't know. What do you know about recycling?
Not as much as you, for sure. But
yeah, I didn't. I was just like you. Trust me. There's a lot of times where I'm like, I don't want to know any of this stuff. So recycling well, let's go back and we'll talk about recycling. Recycling itself is scrapping. So it's easier to do that. I always tell people it's just scrapping with better marketing. But it's generally for your waste, for your trash, things that you don't want to use anymore. But in order to scrap something, you have to separate it into specific materials. So if you're scrapping metal, it's sort of easy. You can pick it up with a magnet, get it out, separate it, and then they melt all the metal down. And it's sort of, when you melt metal down, it levels out. So this top level will have this lighter metal, this middle level will have this different metal, and the bottom level will have this other metal. And there'll be slag on the top. You scoop all that stuff. Mm-hmm. It's very energy consuming, but it's easier to do. Plastic is a little bit different. You actually have to separate the stuff, because if you mix the two plastics, you can't actually recycle it. And it ends up being not a good deal. So you want to separate all these different types of materials. And to do that on a mass scale, eventually they came up with something called the single stream. So there's different streams. So you can imagine, like, you throw in all your stuff into one stream and it goes somewhere, mm-hmm. and then they sort it out there. There's other things called dual streams, which is sort of what this is, where you separate the material. So you can think of, there was a time where Baltimore used to separate the paper, right? You put the paper over here, but you keep all the other stuff in this bin. And that's because they had a buyer for the paper. Because recycling or scrapping is a for-profit industry. Mm-hmm. So if they can't actually make money off the thing, it's waste to them as well, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So paper's pretty easily recyclable. There's a big old industry for it. Metal is easily recyclable because you can separate it, and it becomes a commodity. So the eventual price for that thing that you're recycling is really the economic driver of that type of industry. So for instance, if you do aluminum for the last 20 years has had I think it's like a 33-cent per pound price on it. Very consistent. You can sort of build a business off of that price. Okay. When we started with this plastic, it was 2 cents a pound. It's just not valuable. So they, unless it's not valuable to separate small things, right? So you can imagine it's just not enough meat on the bone for them to actually make any money quickly. Right. Because when it's 2 cents a pound, you actually have to have 40,000 pounds to be able to sell it. And it has to be a certain quality. So it has to be a certain, like, if you're going to have 40,000 pounds of number 5 plastic, the way the industry was right when we started, you had to have a contamination rate. That means any other materials in that number 5 had to be less than 0.5%. So 40,000 pounds, 0.5% is, it's hard to verify that you have this kind of quality material. And then it's only 2 cents a pound. Well, 40,000 pounds of cannabis pop tops is 7 53-foot containers. We didn't produce that many at that point in Maryland. And I was like, so anyway, that particular price per pound tells you where when you can transport it, when you can sort of send it to the next place, because that's the limit. It's the transportation cost. So dual stream is when you separate the material prior to putting it all in one thing. The single stream is the sort of what everybody ended up with. So you're talking about your blue containers outside of your house, your recycling, whatever containers outside of your business, they all go to the single stream. A dual stream would be like the oil that some food producers actually separate and put out to the back. That goes to a different place, right? Mm-hmm. So it's about separation. So for the single stream, they ended up, they all go to some place called an MRF, a material recovery facility, which is sort of like this Willy Wonka style sorting facility. You can imagine what you think of in these bigger, bags are flying and things are going all over the place. But what happens first is there's, so I'm in Cecil County, right? Yep. And I throw stuff in a blue bin and it goes to the local dump. And this happens in every county. It's just, this one does this one thing. Each one, I'll tell you about other ones. But so I send it to this dump. They send it from there. They only have a buyer for the paper. So they take off all the big pieces of paper that they can get because they have somebody who will pay for that. Okay. And that's an income stream. So they want that. Everything else is trash to them because they don't actually recycle. So there is a recycling coordinator whose job it is to actually do the logistics and figure out where to send this material to be recycled. So they all go to MRFs. Or material recovery facilities. The recovery facilities are spread out through the state of Maryland. There are four are privately owned and 2 are county owned. Okay. So the privately owned ones are there for money and money only. Turns out the county ones are there for money and money only too. So from my county, we ship it to Baltimore County, which is a decent amount away. And we pay them for that. So that comes out of our citizens' taxes or residential taxes. So my stuff goes to the dump drops it out of that truck onto something called a roll-off container, which is an open top sort of giant dumpster, right? And then they put that on a truck and they pay for that truck to drive from Cecil County to Baltimore County. And then at Baltimore County, they drop off the roll-off. Now this goes over the water and a bunch of other stuff, and it's an open top, remember? So stuff flies out the whole damn top. Right. In fact, that's an industry term. It's called leakage. When stuff comes up, there's a standard leakage number of 3%. So 3% of all your trash is expected to go out there. Yeah, it's expected. Yeah. So it's an actual measurement that if you go over that, then they want to do something about. But if you go under that, then they give you a little sticker. You didn't do it as badly as you could have. So then they go over to Baltimore County and they drop it off on this big ass conveyor belt, right? And they run all the stuff over a conveyor belt. Now the conveyor belt leads to a screen, and I don't know if I always call it a scrog screen because that's obvious why. Anyway, other people would call it a a horizontal trellis or a horizontal kind of system so it's a screen with holes in it, but I call it a scrog screen because the sizing is similar. It's a 4-inch hole. So anything smaller than 4 inches is going to fall through that hole, right? Mm-hmm. Everything that falls through the hole gets sent over, is considered, not enough meat on the bone, too much work to actually make any money off of, all considered trash and goes into the local dumps, period, done. So everything from Cecil County that doesn't get, it turns out that it's about 3% of the stuff that you throw that people typically throw in their blue bin ends up getting recycled. That's like, it's incredible to me. And it's all about this system behind it. It's very difficult. And they they had gotten sort of complacent. They were sending everything to China for China to deal with. It was waste was our number one export. Mixed recyclables was the US's number one export. And then China in 2017 and implemented in 2018, so they wouldn't take any because they changed the spec. So it was 5% contamination. Then they just crunched it down to 0.5%. Nobody could meet that spec.
Right.
So then we actually have to deal with it now. So since 2018, none of our stuff has been leaving. It's all been, we had to deal with our own stuff here. And it wasn't just the United States. It's about 92% of the world, which is a lot of it. Used to send their stuff to China. Now everybody's got to eat it. So it's here, it stays here. So what happens when you have 97% of your trash or your recycling staying here now?
Right.
It ends up, they put it in the landfills and it stays in the landfills and it just fills up the landfills. So during the pandemic, while everybody, it's the same thing happening at the exact same time, the landfill capacities have just been so reduced. Baltimore is, I think the last time I checked, when I was looking, I stopped looking because it was freaking me out. But they stopped collecting recycling and all types of stuff too. The landfill capacity in Baltimore is almost full. So they're actually having to ship out. So they ship it to other places, just the regular trash, because they don't have enough room. And that you're paying for, right? Not only can you not, is the system not able to catch and do anything with all this material, you're going to pay for it. And the end result is the people have to pay for that stuff. And then on top of that, the health effects and the environmental effects are just crazy. So all this stuff is happening at the same time. And, we ended up contacting every recycling coordinator and going through all of the different cannabis packages. What's the best one? Is there a best one? What's the least bad one? Eventually, going through all these things. Because I don't know. I didn't know. And I wasn't sure how they, how to define that. And it turned out that no matter what, I showed him bags, I showed him big pop tops, I showed him, there's the giant ones, I showed him all types of stuff. And he said, no, I can't, we don't recycle any of that stuff. And I'd call every other one. I'd call, the ones that were supposed to be really good at it, the best in the state. And when you talk to the people in the front end, you read the flyer and they'd be like, oh yeah, I can take this. And then you'd call and you'd say, well, here, it's this big. And they'd say, no, I don't want that shit. And you'd be like, well, what do you want me to do with it?
Right.
And they'd say, throw it away. So it didn't matter. If you were a patient, if you threw it in your blue bin, it was going in the trash. If you threw it in the regular trash can, that's exactly where it was going. It just felt like a lie. Like I was lying to myself by throwing it in the recycling. So we were a little bit like, what the heck? So while we were talking to the recycling coordinators, they explained all this stuff, that it was basically an economic decision from the industry. They didn't have the infrastructure to actually separate it well. And the economic impact was it was too difficult to actually do, which resulted in, us having to fill up landfills extremely quickly. I don't know if you've ever done, maybe you shouldn't, but if you Google where the landfills are, you'll find out where they are. And if you Google, or if you just look at that and then you associate that with all the different things that happen environmentally around it, you'll find out right away why this is a concern. And so, there was questions. What do you do? How do you do this? How much recycling is the cannabis in, how do you do any of this? So the recycling coordinators helped us understand. And then they actually told us you got to start a nonprofit, because the obstacle was financial. It wasn't that you couldn't recycle number 5 plastic. The option was The obstacle was that they couldn't do it. So the people who were wanting to were us, and the people who were supposed to weren't able to. So, working that out and trying to understand that, and then bringing it back to the MMCC and the dispensaries and stuff like that is really an educational thing. And then how do you build this out? How do you create a system that enables people to do this? And how do you help the dispensary? So it became it's obviously a community kind of deal. Patients bring back their stuff to participating collection centers, their dispensaries. It's part of their customer journey.
Right.
They go home, smoke weed, they empty the weed or whatever they do with the weed. I don't know. Some people do other stuff. And then they bring it back. And it becomes, this thing, this cycle that they can build a habit. They don't have to really think about it too hard. And that's what we ask from the dispensaries. How can you help? You can do this. You can actually, set aside a part of your place to capture this stuff back. You're only going to capture so much.
Right.
But it's about enabling people to pick up their trash and put it in the trash can, or whatever the deal is, the thing to do the right thing. So that's all, and so that's sort of how that came about. So we surveyed a whole bunch of different patients, and it turned out that everybody was doing the same thing. When we were new patients, you have this bin or this bag or something that sits in the side. And the first, you keep your first jar, and you're like, ooh, first jar. And then the second jar, and then the third jar, and you start filling up this. You can't keep them on your shelf or in the kitchen or whatever, because they get in your way when they're empty. You don't want to keep them, empty thing. So you throw them in this bag because, there's medical information on there. It turned out that every new patient that we were talking to did the same thing. They all had a bag or a bin or something in their closet where they had all their weed container jars that were empty. And then all of a sudden they wanted to throw them away. And that's exactly what was happening to us. So, yeah, we were saving them because we knew throwing them in the trash didn't feel right.
Right.
So eventually, we created the path. We learned what that path was. How did you have to do it? Who would do that? All right. So let's say you collected them and now you got them. Where do they go then? What is the process? So the first part of recycling is, I don't know if you can see this number 5 thing here, but it's got these 3 arrows, right? So that's what recycling is. It's a full circular process. It's got 3 steps to it. The first step is bringing it back, collecting it, separating it, all these other things that you have to do to get it back down to essentially just number 5 plastic. And then that's step 1. Step 2 is you give that stuff to a manufacturer, and the manufacturer makes something out of it, right? So they make something, and you'll see these things that'll say like X amount of percent post-consumer or post, recycled content or whatnot. And then the third step, it's 3 steps, is when you, the consumer, buy one of those things. So in your mind, or in my mind, I went through, all right, how much plastic is there in the world? There's a lot. I don't know the manufacturing step, how many people are making stuff out of that stuff, but I can tell you that there's not many things that I could find that were recycled content plastic. Most of it, you can easily see, most of it isn't recycled.
Right.
Where does it go? What is it used for? You had to learn all that stuff. So we had to find, we had to figure out what we could do. So the first part was give it to somebody who knew how to do this. And then nobody was willing to do it. Well, I guess we could have stopped there. Well, that sucked. But, as life has it, you talk to friends and they, call you out or whatever the deal is. And you're like, all right, fine. And then you start something and you build out the system. All right, here's how it goes. So our process is interesting, but we at the time when we were looking for, so we do this one step and we were looking to give it to somebody else who could sell it and make that conversion to the second step. Those people are called post-secondary processors. And they take that material and make it into a raw material, whatever it is. Most of them just clean it up and then they're the distributor to the manufacturers for this type of material. And at the time, we looked all over the place and you can't find one. And that's because there weren't any. At the time, you know, it was right when China stopped their stuff with the national sword. And so there wasn't any US based secondary processors. We were exporting it all, which seemed crazy. So we actually found the only one in the United States at that point. There's been a few more that could do anything with number 5 polypropylene. There are some that can do stuff. Most of the people, if you talk to any of the recycling coordinators in Maryland right now, they will talk to you about number 1 plastic and number 2 plastic. There's paths for those, certain ones. They have to be so big and blah, 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 blah. It's very sort of detailed and weird. But there wasn't anything for number 5 plastic because it just wasn't worth. Remember, it was 2 cents a pound. Everybody was like, shh, make more money than that on cans.
Right.
So there's no money in it. Nobody wants to do it. What are you going to do? So we ended up having to contact it. They're actually in Alabama. Yeah. So they had a contract with, you know, one of these, the recycling companies, just in the case, you know, how do you do this? How do you clean up number 5 plastic? And they're the ones that we take our stuff to.
Okay.
And they do a wash and then they grind it down a little bit finer than we do to put it into the industry standard for it's called PCR, or post-consumer recycled plastic. And they can actually clean it up and have a buyer for it. And, you know, our goal was sort of, all right, how do you actually recycle it? Not just say you're recycling it. How do you act? You know, people want to do this. I would like to recycle my stuff. How do you enable that? And that sort of became how we do stuff. You know, it is about creating a path. And that path should have really good positive feedback loops. You know, that positive feedback loop thing is a really big deal. If you don't get any enjoyment or there's no positivity to it, you just won't do it. You'll see it as work. And you'll be like, screw that. I don't have to.
Right.
And you'll find reasons that you don't want to. And this is about how, you know, how do you create positive feedback loops to enable people to do that? And, you know, so we built out a system and we went to the dispensaries and we said, what do you think? And they said, prove it.
Right.
You know, the thing. So we ended up, you know, after a little while, we got a few dispensaries. You know, I remember, yeah, it was a pretty interesting thing. We went to this one dispensary and I pitched them, me and my wife, and we pitched them and we said, what do you think about this problem? What do you think about, you know, us trying to help? And they were like, does it cost, you know, they had a lot of, and then so they ended up actually trying, you know, they tried, they gave us a shot. And that was the first piece of positive feedback. And then we went to another one and we said, what do you think? And they tried and they rocked it. I was like, you know, this is a pilot program. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. It's very transparent. Everybody helps one another, or at least we try. So if they have questions or something, or have better ideas, like there's no best practices in this yet. So it's, you know, we're sort of trying to create what are the best practices? How do you enable people and get them excited to do these things? You know, so that's what it ended up becoming. You know, there was a problem and we ended up trying to figure out a way to solve it and enabling people to do it. We worked with the recycling coordinators throughout the state, the experts. We worked with the people. Every aspect of this is about working to try and help people do what they already want to do.
Right.
and just enabling them to do it, and it turns out to be a really cool thing. We were concerned about a lot of stuff, but I think I did the numbers, I guess, this past weekend, and we're somewhere around, I don't know, 300 and almost 350,000 of these little pop-top things have come back. So it becomes an interesting, it became an interesting sort of scenario where the people actually, they 100% do bring this stuff back. And they 100% do not want to necessarily negatively impact their environment. And so we just sort of enable them to do it and say, all right, go for it. You do that, I'll do this, we'll ship it over there. And as a community, we'll get it done. Every person that's involved in this, every team, every dispensary, every person bringing it back has got to do a little bit of the work, and they all pick up just a little bit. And eventually you get to recycle that same amount, or whatever the amount is. So 350,000 pop tops. It's just an incredible amount of work that people are doing to just try and do the right thing. And that gives you this really good feedback loop, right? It's, oh, wow. I think one person had asked at one point, what's the difference between recycling cannabis containers and other containers? And there's no difference. It's just number 5 plastic. The difference that I think I told them was it smells better.
So is there anything that you particularly looking forward to in regards to how, I guess, the cannabis industry here kind of evolves with that, like more sustainable packaging, more reusing of those plastics, more dispensary participation? There are the things that you're like, this is what I want to see in the future relative to what High Five is doing? And just
sure. Yeah, I mean, in the local industry, what I would really like to see, so there are different obstacles for this industry in every single state.
Yeah.
It's a very unusual business kind of scenario. So you can't really gain on economies of scale for a solution. If you were an MSO or something like that, they use different packaging in every state,
right,
and have different obstacles in every state. So what you can do in Oregon, you can't do here yet.
Right.
So I'm actually super excited to start to see some reuse or return kind of programs. There's currently an obstacle. The MMCC is the obstacle, but I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to sort of develop another pilot program that enables dispensaries and growers and whomever to actually reuse or return and reuse that packaging. The recycling isn't going to get it all. We're a very small thing. And in general, of all the materials produced, you can recycle, even in the single stream or any of that stuff, the best you're going to get is about 9%. So if you produce, 1 million, you're only going to get 9% of that caught in the recycling thing if you're really good. So you need other options to try and mitigate or minimize those things. Reuse is a great one. There are other ones. People talk about a lot of greenwash stuff like bioplastics and stuff like that. They're not there yet. They do the exact same thing. If you get bioplastics in Maryland, you cannot do anything with it. Most of the glass in Maryland, luckily right now, we're starting to see recycling coordinators be able to do something with glass. But when we started, you couldn't recycle glass at all in Maryland. Yeah, I know. They'll tell you can, but you actually can't.
Okay.
They don't have a path for it. They don't have a buyer. Normally, the way that, we were lucky, my county just got recycling. They did a deal with Delaware. In the lower counties, there's a little bit more of an option because Virginia has glass factories. But they use it generally for alternative daily cover on the landfills. So they'll break down the glass and apply it over top of the landfill so the stuff doesn't fly off into the water. That's alternative daily cover. Is that recycling? No. It's reusing. man.
Yeah.
But it's different. It's
Right.
not necessarily what you think it is. So it's a different way, but it doesn't actually capture it. You can wash your dish. It seems very, it turns out statistically, if you do a reuse program, like if you reuse something once, you prevent 71 of the same things from being produced upstream. So you're just blocking things from actually having to be produced to be caught at the end. And it seems like a simple thing. It's not perfect. There's lots of different ways to do it and whatever, but you never know until you try. This was, the recycling is the MMCC calling BS on me and saying I couldn't do it, or saying we couldn't do it, saying it wasn't a need. It is a need. The cannabis industry has produced somewhere around, just in flower, here locally in Maryland, just in flower, I think the last number I got was somewhere around 726,000 pounds of pop tops.
Mm.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see that. A lot of people are like, why do you recycle cannabis stuff? It's because it's too small. You have to do this because the stuff is too small. It's not because there's weed in it. The patients, the people that work in it who don't want to do that, they have the ability to make a difference and make a change and actually lead in this scenario. And I think they have the right motivation to do it. They inherently come in more environmentally friendly than other people, more conscious of their role in the greater, in nature, that they're not different from nature, they're part of it. And that openness allows people to try different things. You don't have to be right. You just have to freaking try.
Right.
And eventually something will happen that's really good. There's lots of reasons to just wash your dish. It just makes sense, right? The recycling stuff drives me nuts because it's like, all right, if I had a dish, if I was the life of the dish, and instead of washing my dish, I threw it in a special bin that I hoped someday somebody would separate those materials, grind it down, make me a new dish, and then I was going to go find it at the local store.
Right. And you're right. It just seems like such a given. Like a patient will go to a dispensary, get an eighth of MK Ultra or whatever, and they're like, I'll probably get this strain again. I like this flower. I like this bud. I'm just gonna, when I'm done with this, I'm just gonna wash the container out, go back to the dispensary and get some more MK Ultra and just use the same container. And it's like the patients have never been adverse to the idea of any of this. And I think even in talking with patients and talking about, what you guys are doing, it's never been, we don't want to do it. It was just not knowing how much waste was produced, and they had the opportunity to kind of do something about that. So I'm hopeful, like you are, that reuse will be an option at some point. It just makes sense at the end of the day.
I'm very proud of the local cannabis community for doing something like this. Just giving it a shot, trying it, and being, they do really well. I mean, Peake ReLeaf has that bin outside, and each one does it a little bit different, but the patients pick it right up, and it's so easy that they don't have any kind of thought about it. I just do this thing, I drop off my stuff, no big deal. That's awesome, right on. And it's supposed to give you that high five.
And is one of the things that I think surprises people in talking about having the bin out there and trying to make sure that patients get engaged and involved in that, is that they really think patients need to feel an additional level of incentive to participate in something like this. And by and large, patients just really need to be made aware that it's an option. And that's enough of an incentive for them to say, oh, I can do something better than I was doing before with this. It doesn't really cost me anything to do. I'm going to be coming back to the dispensary anyway. During my trip, let me just bring these empty containers. And now I'm participating in something that is improving my community.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a huge grand gesture for somebody to feel like they're a part of something that's doing well.
No, people, yeah, exactly that. They wanted to do something with it.
Yeah.
They wanted to do something that they wanted the opportunity to do the right thing with it,
Yeah.
whatever that might have been. And you guys are doing that. You give them the opportunity to drop it off. That little change between I drop it off in my trash or I drop it over here gives them that enough of a positive feedback that they know they're doing the right thing. And it's a cool thing to see. Yeah, but you're 100% right. I mean, some people don't need that extra. It's just opening the door, and they're like, okay, that's the path I'm supposed to walk. Okay, I'll walk that path. And then they do, and they're like, that's dope. I like that.
Right. It's pretty good.
You can make it fun, it's even better.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's the best part for me, is when people get excited and they sort of understand, all right, I'm doing this next thing. When we do cleanups, it's the same idea. It's about feedback loops for the patient, or not the patient, the volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's all the patients are in this. They're volunteering to do the right thing. So it's about removing obstacles and allowing people to do the things that they want to do. And then at the end, our biggest goal is that we enable somebody to sort of exercise or activate or express. It's just an innate value. It's called an environmental stewardship. It's a value. And it means that you're tied into nature, and you understand, not nature necessarily, but you understand that you are nature.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not separate. It's not an us versus them thing. There is no such thing. Instead, you're a part of that. And part of being a part of something is maintaining it and caring for it. And a lot of times we find that people don't even know that they're a part of nature, or they don't know that they can do these things, and they don't know why. But to enable them, they know that they don't like this one thing, though.
Yeah.
So they don't, maybe not, that's beautiful, but I don't like the trash there or something.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we've seen, even with some of the cleanups that we've done, is that people, when they're able to see that immediate difference that they made, it's like, oh, I didn't realize it was just this simple, where I could be out here with you all for an afternoon and see a very tangible difference in how this park looks, or how this area looks, or how my community looks. Whenever you guys do it, I'll come back out. It's just, it really just starts with that really small realization of, I didn't realize I, could make this much of an immediate impact just by spending an afternoon picking up some trash. Well, Phil, I really appreciate you taking the time today, man. We had a really good conversation, and I really feel like the more patients have an understanding of that small action leading to a much larger impact, the more they'll be incentivized to participate in it. Because I know we still have some patients that aren't as immediately familiar with how big a difference this can make. So I appreciate you, sitting with me, taking the time to explain what High Five does and why we love working with you all, and why your organization is so important, man.
Well, I appreciate that very much. Yeah. It's just about, it's about community and enabling them to do what they want to do, the right things.